Picture a long conference table. The air is thick with voices, charts, and arguments. Everyone is fighting to be heard, to prove they have the sharpest idea, the fastest solution, the winning edge. And then, at the far end of the table, there is one man who does not fight at all. He does not raise his voice. He does not scramble to claim credit. He sits back, listening, unmoved by the storm. The others glance at him with irritation. They whisper, "He's lost his drive. He doesn't care anymore." In a world where competition is the badge of relevance, his silence looks like weakness. But then, weeks later, the storm outside the office changes. The market shifts. The numbers crash. The same men who once laughed at him now find themselves circling back. And the quiet man, the one who seemed to be left behind, is the only one who is calm enough to see clearly. Now, they need him. And when they ask for his guidance, he does not rush to please. He sets the terms. This is the paradox. The man who stops competing appears powerless at first. But in reality, by refusing the race, he gains a form of power the others cannot even recognize until it is too late. When everyone else runs in circles, the one who stands still changes the entire game. Because if you do not need the race, then the race no longer controls you. What does it really mean when a man walks away from the race? Most people see only failure. They assume he could not keep up, that he lacked the hunger, that he chose comfort over victory. But what if the opposite is true? What if the act of stepping away is not surrender but strategy? Modern life has trained us to believe competition is the natural state of men. From school grades to corporate ladders, from promotions to possessions, we are told to measure ourselves against the man next to us. To stop competing in this framework looks like choosing death over life. Yet Carl Jung and Arthur Schopenhauer reveal a deeper truth. Jung shows us what happens in the mind of the man who no longer plays by society's script. He exposes the mask we wear and the shadow we fear when we cannot stop running. Schopenhauer explains the invisible force inside us that keeps pushing, the blind will that traps us in endless striving, never letting us rest. Together they show why a man who stops competing may appear to lose everything in the eyes of the crowd. But in reality, he gains something far greater, a power that cannot be bought, stolen, or even understood by those still running. Stopping is not weakness, it is rewriting the rules of the game. Carl Jung believed that most men live their lives behind a mask. He called it the persona. It is the face we put on to convince the world we belong. The tireless worker, the charming executive, the reliable provider, the man who never stops competing. The persona is rewarded. It keeps the crowd satisfied, the system running, and the man himself busy enough to forget the questions he does not want to ask. But beneath the mask lies the shadow. The shadow is not simply the dark side of man. It is everything he has denied, ignored, or buried. Fear of being insignificant, fear of being rejected, fear of being without worth if he is not winning. Competition becomes the perfect disguise. As long as the man is running, no one has to see the shadow, not even himself. Jung warned that the longer we hide behind the persona, the more we become possessed by the shadow. The man who cannot stop competing is not proving his strength. He is proving his terror of being unmasked. He is running not toward victory, but away from the sight of his own reflection. Now consider what happens when a man stops competing. The persona begins to crack. At first it is humiliating. The applause fades. The compliments die. People whisper that he has lost his edge. He feels the shadow creeping closer. The doubts he worked so hard to bury finally stand in the open. And yet, this confrontation is exactly what Jung called individuation. It is the painful process of integrating the parts of ourselves we tried to exile. The man who stops competing is forced to meet his shadow face to face. Instead of proving his worth through endless victories, he learns to hold his worth without them. He realizes that his identity does not collapse just because he is no longer in the race. This moment is terrifying, but it is also the turning point. Because once the shadow is acknowledged, it loses its power to haunt. The man who has embraced his shadow becomes whole. He no longer needs the persona to survive. And without the mask, he is free. There is another layer to this that Jung described with clarity. Projection. When a man stops competing, those still trapped in the race do not merely ignore him, they attack him. They call him lazy, bitter, irrelevant. But this is not truly about him. It is their own shadow projected outward. They see in him the possibility they fear most, the possibility that all their striving is unnecessary. So they condemn him, not to punish him, but to silence their own suspicion. This is why the man who stops competing gains a strange kind of power. He becomes a mirror that others cannot bear to look into. They sense that he is free in a way they are not, and that freedom feels dangerous. Because if one man can walk away, then the whole system of comparison, envy, and endless motion begins to look fragile. Jung understood that true authority does not come from the persona. It comes from the self, the integrated whole that emerges only when shadow and persona are reconciled. The man who stops competing steps onto the path of individuation, and in doing so, he discovers a foundation that cannot be shaken by applause or criticism. He becomes unpredictable because his choices are no longer dictated by the crowd. He becomes unshakable because he no longer fears the judgment of others. And he becomes untouchable because no reward the world can offer is greater than the freedom he has already claimed. This is why people do not understand him. They cannot predict him because they still believe every man must chase status, money, recognition. He proves by his very existence that there is another way to live. And that proof alone is enough to unsettle those who are still running. Jung would say, this man has shifted his center of gravity from the persona to the self. He has stopped measuring his value in external victories. He has anchored it in the deeper process of becoming whole. And because of this, the usual weapons of society, praise, blame, shame, competition, no longer control him. In the end, Jung shows us that the power of the man who stops competing is not loud or aggressive. It is quiet, but it is absolute. Because once you have faced your shadow, once you have stripped away the mask, there is nothing left for the world to hold over you. And a man who cannot be manipulated by fear of loss or hunger for gain is a man who holds a kind of power that those still running can never understand. Arthur Schopenhauer looked at human life and saw something unsettling. He believed that beneath all our plans and ambitions, there is a blind force he called the will. Not reason, not logic, not even desire in the ordinary sense, but a restless, insatiable drive that pushes us to keep going, to keep wanting, to keep competing. For Schopenhauer, this will was the real master. It does not ask us politely, it commands. It drives men into battles they do not even need to fight. It is why the wealthy man still hungers for more, why the promoted executive feels only a brief satisfaction before craving the next step, why the winner of today is already restless about tomorrow. The will is never satisfied. Each victory tastes sweet for a moment, then fades into bitterness, replaced by the next craving. What once felt like triumph becomes the new baseline, and so the man must run faster, harder, chasing a feeling that always slips away. Schopenhauer compared human striving to a pendulum swinging between pain and boredom. Pain when we want something and do not have it. Boredom when we finally get it and discover it does not fill the emptiness. Competition in this light is not a noble pursuit, but a mechanism that keeps the pendulum moving, keeps men from noticing the futility of the swing. This is why men cannot stop competing, not because the race has meaning, but because the will demands motion. To stop feels unbearable. To sit still feels like death. And yet, Schopenhauer insisted, the only real liberation comes not from obeying the will, but from resisting it. He admired those rare individuals who stepped out of the cycle, the artist who creates not for applause but for expression, the philosopher who seeks truth, not victory, the man who looks at the endless race for status and wealth and quietly says, no. This act of renunciation is not weakness, it is selective strength, because not all competition is meaningless. Some struggles refine us, force us to grow, sharpen our skills. But most of the contests men pour their lives into are hollow. Who has the bigger office? Who drives the newer car? Who can outwork his rivals until his health collapses? Schopenhauer would call these the empty games of the will, bait to keep men running in circles. The man who stops competing in the wrong arenas gains a freedom that is invisible to those still trapped. He learns to choose his battles. He preserves his energy for what matters. He is no longer exhausted by the constant demand to prove himself in every meaningless contest. There is a brutal clarity in Schopenhauer's view. To live under the will is to be enslaved by an appetite that never ends. To deny the will, even in part, is to reclaim autonomy. It is to take back the power to say, this fight is not worth me. And this too unsettles society, because a man who is no longer driven by endless appetite is unpredictable. He cannot be manipulated by promises of more. He cannot be controlled by threats of less. He becomes immune to the levers that keep most men in line. Schopenhauer's conclusion was stark. Happiness is not found in chasing more, but in needing less. The man who stops competing discovers a strange paradox. By refusing the race, he gains more peace, more clarity, and in time, more influence than those still scrambling. Because while they exhaust themselves chasing what they can never keep, he conserves his strength, invests it where it counts, and stands apart. This is not the path of retreat. It is the path of mastery. Not mastery over others, but mastery over the will itself. And in Schopenhauer's world, that was the highest form of power. The quiet man who walks away from the futile contests of the crowd is not empty. He is full of his own time, his own choices, his own strength. And that fullness is something the men still trapped in endless striving will never understand until they see him standing still, unbothered, while they continue to run themselves into the ground. Carl Jung shows us what happens in the mind when a man stops competing. The persona cracks, the shadow surfaces, and the projections of others fall onto him. It is a psychological storm, but if he endures it, he emerges whole, free from the masks that kept him running. Arthur Schopenhauer explains why the race feels impossible to abandon in the first place. The blind will pushes men forward, hungry for victories that never last. He shows that liberation comes only when a man chooses to resist the cycle, to step out of contests that consume but never satisfy. Together, Jung and Schopenhauer reveal a truth that shakes the foundation of modern life. To stop competing is not to fall behind. It is to step outside the trap entirely. It is to face the fears that drive us and to silence the will that enslaves us. The result is a kind of power that ordinary men cannot see, because it does not come from winning more battles, it comes from refusing the wrong ones. The man who stops competing cannot be bribed, cannot be predicted, cannot be owned, and that makes him more powerful than anyone still running. Consider John. For 20 years he climbed the corporate ladder. Late nights, endless travel, constant competition for the next title. He won again and again until the victories began to taste like ash. One morning, John resigned from his executive role. He did not retire. He did not collapse. He re-emerged as an independent advisor, choosing when to work, with whom, and on what terms. The men who stayed behind whispered that he had lost his edge. But when the company faced crisis, it was John they called. This time, he dictated the rules. His strength came not from racing harder, but from walking away. Then there is Marcus, a craftsman who once tried to scale his business, chasing volume and growth like every competitor in his trade. Orders multiplied, stress mounted, quality slipped. Marcus made a decision that seemed insane. He cut back production, reduced clients, and focused only on pieces he could perfect. The industry mocked him at first, but slowly his work became sought after, not because it was everywhere, but because it was rare. Marcus discovered that stepping out of the numbers game gave him a different kind of leverage. He no longer begged for customers. They lined up for him. And finally, Dave. In his community, men competed constantly for recognition, titles, and influence. Dave did not. He kept his head down, avoided the spotlight, and focused on simple acts of service. When a crisis struck, a storm, a blackout, a moment of real need, it was Dave the neighbors turned to. Not the men with titles, but the man who had never asked for applause. Because when the show ended, he was the only one still standing. Each of these men chose to step off the track. Each was dismissed, doubted, even ridiculed. But when the dust settled, they held something their competitors did not: freedom, leverage, and a form of power that could not be taken from them. The man who stops competing does not fade into irrelevance. He becomes the one others depend on when their own race runs out of road. When a man stops competing, the change is not just personal. It creates visible effects that others feel, even if they cannot explain why. His decision unlocks specific mechanisms of power that are invisible to the men still racing. First, unpredictability. The man who does not need the next promotion, the next favor, the next handshake, cannot be controlled by the usual carrots and sticks. He becomes harder to read, harder to manipulate, and that uncertainty itself is power. Second, optionality. Because he is not tied to every contest, he preserves his energy and attention. He can choose when and where to engage, and when he does step in, his presence carries weight because it is rare. Third, compounding value. While others burn themselves out in endless contests, he invests his time in skills, depth, and relationships that grow stronger with age. What looks like inactivity is actually accumulation. Fourth, projection collapse. When people mock or attack him for stepping out, they are exposing their own fear of irrelevance. Over time, those projections collapse, and the quiet man is revealed as the only one standing outside the hysteria. Fifth, moral contrast. By refusing to compete in shallow games, he makes the desperation of others more visible. His restraint highlights their frenzy, and people begin to see the difference. Sixth, attention resignaling. At first, he loses the spotlight, but as chaos grows, the absence of his neediness becomes magnetic. When he finally speaks, people listen because he is not competing for their ears every second of the day. These 6 mechanisms explain why stepping out of the race does not mean disappearing. It means shifting from being one more runner in the crowd to becoming the man everyone quietly orbits around. Society does not take kindly to men who step out of the race. The reason is simple. The system depends on constant motion. Consumer economies thrive on comparison. If one man refuses to compete, he threatens the illusion that everyone must keep striving to stay relevant. Organizations rely on predictable behavior. They want men who chase the bonus, the title, the next seat at the table. A man who cannot be baited with these rewards is dangerous. He cannot be placed neatly on the chart. He cannot be counted on to run when the whistle blows. And then there is the crowd. When one man stops competing, he becomes a mirror they cannot avoid. His refusal forces them to confront their own exhaustion, their own doubts, their own fear that they are running for nothing. So they label him weak, lazy, or bitter, not because he is, but because they need him to be. The truth is, the man who stops competing is not breaking himself. He is breaking the story that keeps everyone else in line. And that is why the system moves so quickly to repair the error. Walking away from the race is not without cost. Some relationships fade when you no longer play the same game. Income may dip in the short term when you stop chasing every opportunity, and the labels will come: quitter, dreamer, underachiever. These are the tolls every man must pay at the gate of freedom, but there are traps as well. The first is the fake quit, where a man pretends to step away but secretly hungers for recognition. The second is passive escape, where he withdraws not from strength but from fear. The third is overcompensation, where he rejects all ambition and sinks into apathy. The way through is clarity. Selective renunciation, not total retreat. Know which contests are hollow and which struggles are worth your time. That choice alone separates the man who quits from the man who transcends. Stopping the race is not a single decision. It is a discipline. A man must train himself to step out of the wrong contests and step into the battles that matter. This is why the path can be laid out in 12 deliberate weeks. In the first 3 weeks, audit and cut. Write down the arenas where you are competing only for approval. Start cutting one by one. Cancel the needless contests, the shallow comparisons, the empty goals. In weeks 4 through 6, deepen your skill. Use the freed energy to sharpen one ability that compounds with time, something that cannot be taken away when titles vanish. Weeks 7 through 9 focus on optionality. Learn to negotiate, to say no, to build margins in your life. The power of refusal grows with practice. And in the final 3 weeks, consolidate. Write a personal manifesto. Define what you stand for and what you will no longer chase. Anchor it in writing so the world cannot move you so easily. The markers are clear. More hours of deep work, more offers refused, less anxiety when others sprint past you. These are the signs that the race is no longer running you. You are choosing the terms. The truth is simple. Stopping does not mean losing. It means refusing to be owned by a game designed to keep you running forever. Jung showed us the man who faces his shadow and no longer needs the mask. Schopenhauer showed us the man who resists the blind will and no longer runs in circles. Together they reveal why the man who stops competing gains a power that others cannot even recognize until they see it standing in front of them. Now the question is yours. Can you stop even for a moment? For the next 14 days, resist the urge to display, to boast, to prove. Do not post the win. Do not chase the applause. Instead, keep a daily record of 3 simple lines: what you did, why you did it, and whether it was for yourself or for the crowd. You do not need them to understand you. You only need to understand your own worth. 14 days, no display. When you are done, write in the comments, "I tried."